Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. November 17, 1973. The air in Sioux Falls, South Dakota carried the sharp bite of late autumn. The kind of cold that seeps through jackets and reminds you that winter is waiting just around the corner. For most teenagers in the area, Saturday nights meant football games, drive-in movies, or gathering at someone's house while parents were away. It was a simpler time, an era when doors were left unlocked, when children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, and when the worst thing parents worried about was their kids staying out past curfew. In the small farming communities that dotted the tri-state area where South Dakota, Iowa, and Minnesota meet, everyone knew everyone. Neighbors helped neighbors. Churches were full on Sunday mornings. High school football games were the social event of the week. It was the kind of place where violent crime seemed like something that happened in big cities, something you read about in the newspaper or saw on the evening news, but never something that could touch your own backyard. That Saturday started like any other. The sun rose over endless fields of harvested corn, the stubble poking through the first dustings of snow. Farmers tended to their livestock. Mothers prepared breakfast. Teenagers slept in, looking forward to a night of freedom. The world felt safe, predictable, ordered. But as the sun began to set that evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, 5 teenagers were preparing for what they thought would be an adventure. A chance to escape the watchful eyes of parents and teachers. A night of music, laughter, and the kind of innocent rebellion that comes with being young and feeling invincible. They were going to Gitche Manitou State Preserve. The preserve sits in the far northwestern corner of Iowa, where the Big Sioux River curves and bends, marking the border between 3 states. It's a place of natural beauty, with ancient rock formations jutting up from the earth, some of the oldest exposed bedrock in North America. The rocks, striped in shades of pink and red, had been sacred to the Dakota and other Native American tribes for centuries. The name itself, Gitche Manitou, means Great Spirit in the Dakota language. It was a place of spiritual significance, a place where earth and sky seemed to meet, but by 1973 it had become something else to local teenagers. It was a party spot, a place where kids could gather around a bonfire, drink beer, play guitars, and feel far away from the rules and expectations of their small town lives. The preserve was remote enough that police rarely patrolled it. The nearest town, Larchwood, Iowa, had a population of barely 700 people. The preserve itself was undeveloped, just raw land and ancient stone, perfect for those seeking privacy. On that November evening, 5 young people made their way to Gitche Manitou. They weren't troublemakers. They weren't running from the law. They were just kids looking for a good time. They packed a cooler with Coca-Cola. Someone brought a radio. Another brought firewood. They drove down the gravel roads that led to the preserve, their headlights cutting through the gathering darkness, music playing, voices laughing. Their names were Mike Hadrath, Stuart Bade, Dana Bade, Roger Essam, and Sandra Chesky. Mike Hadrath was 18 years old, a senior at Canton High School in South Dakota. He was tall and lanky, with shaggy brown hair that fell across his forehead in the style of the time. Mike was known for his easy smile and his love of music. He played guitar, and on weekends, he'd jam with friends, playing Led Zeppelin and Cream covers until his fingers hurt. He was a gentle soul, the kind of kid who'd help his neighbors without being asked, who'd give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. His parents described him as kind-hearted, sometimes too trusting. Mike believed in seeing the good in people. He believed that the world was fundamentally decent. He was planning to graduate that spring and had dreams of becoming a musician, maybe moving to a bigger city where he could play in a real band. But for now he was content with his life in Canton, working part-time at a local gas station, saving money and spending time with his friends. That Saturday night, he was looking his guitar by the fire, maybe singing a few songs, enjoying the company of people he cared about. Stuart Bade was 17, a junior at Larchwood High School. Everyone called him Stu. He was Mike's best friend. and the two were practically inseparable. Where Mike was quiet and introspective, Stu was outgoing and boisterous, always ready with a joke or a prank. He had a mischievous grin and a laugh that was infectious. Stu was an athlete, playing on the school's basketball team, and he had a competitive streak that showed both on the court and off. But beneath the bravado, he was deeply loyal to his friends and family. Stu came from a large farming family, the kind where everyone pitched in with chores and Sunday dinners were loud. Chaotic affairs with too much food and too many stories. He was close to his siblings, especially his younger brother Dana, who looked up to Stu like he hung the moon. That night, Stu was excited about the bonfire. He'd been talking about it all week at school, convincing his friends to come along, promising it would be a night to remember. Dana Bade was 14, Stu's younger brother. He wasn't supposed to be there that night. In fact, his parents had told him he was too young to go out with the older kids. But Dana had begged, and Stu, always protective but also wanting his little brother to feel included, had vouched for him. "I'll keep an eye on him." Stu had promised their parents. "Nothing's going to happen. We're just going to sit around a fire and listen to music." Dana idolized his older brother. He wore his hair the same way, tried to dress like him, even practiced the same mannerisms. He was a good student, quiet and respectful in class, the kind of kid teachers loved. He played Little League baseball and spent his summers helping his father in the fields. His whole life was ahead of him, a blank page waiting to be written. That night, he was thrilled to be included with the older kids, to be treated like one of them instead of Stu's little brother. Roger Essam was 17, another student from the area. Roger was quieter than Stu, more like Mike in temperament. He was a hard worker, often helping his father with farm equipment repairs. Roger had a mechanical mind. He could take apart an engine and put it back together without breaking a sweat. His friends often joked that he could fix anything. He was reliable. The kind of friend you could call at 3 in the morning if your car broke down, and he'd show up with tools and a smile. Roger had plans to join the military after graduation, following in his father's footsteps. He talked about discipline and duty, about seeing the world beyond the cornfields and small towns. But he also loved his community, and part of him wondered if he'd ever really be able to leave. That night, he was just looking forward to a break from thinking about the future, a chance to be young and carefree for a few hours. And then there was Sandra Chesky. Sandra was 13 years old, the youngest of the group by a year. Everyone called her Sandy. She was a pate girl with long, straight brown hair and wide, expressive eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. Sandy was in 8th grade, still navigating the awkward transition from childhood to adolescence. She was smart, earning good grades without much effort, and she loved to read, often losing herself in novels about far-off places and grand adventures. Sandy was also at that age where she desperately wanted to be seen as older, more mature. She wanted to be taken seriously by the high school kids, to be part of their world. When the invitation came to join the bonfire at Gitche Manitou, she jumped at the chance. Her parents were hesitant. 13 was going to be out with 17 and 18-year-olds, but Sandy assured them it would be fine. "We're just going to roast marshmallows and listen to music," she'd said. "There will be other people there. It's totally safe." Her parents, like so many parents in that time and place, believed in giving their children freedom within reason. They trusted their daughter. They trusted the community. They trusted that the world was a good place, and that nothing bad would happen to their little girl, so they let her go. The 5 teenagers arrived at Gitche Manitou State Preserve around 7 o'clock in the evening. The sun had already set, and the sky was darkening from deep blue to black. The temperature was dropping fast, hovering around freezing. They parked near the entrance and made their way on foot toward the rock formations, carrying their supplies, firewood, a cooler, blankets, Mike's guitar. The preserve was quiet, almost eerily so. The wind rustled through the bare trees, and in the distance, they could hear the faint sound of the Big Sioux River moving over rocks. There were no lights, no other people. Just the 5 of them and the vast darkness of the prairie night. They found a good spot near the Sioux quartzite outcroppings, the ancient pink rocks that rose from the earth like the bones of the land itself. Mike started building the fire while Stu and Roger gathered more wood from the surrounding area. Dana helped arrange stones in a circle to contain the flames, and Sandy spread out blankets on the cold ground. Within 20 minutes, they had a fire going, the flames crackling and popping, sending sparks up into the night sky. The warmth was immediate and welcome. They sat in a circle around the fire, passing around cans of soda, talking about music, about nothing everything the way teenagers do. Mike pulled out his guitar and started strumming, playing a few chords of a song everyone recognized. Stu sang along off-key but enthusiastic. Dana laughed at his brother's terrible singing. Roger poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers glow. Sandy sat with her knees pulled up to her chest, smiling, feeling grown up and independent. For a while everything was perfect. The fire burned bright, a small beacon of light in the immense darkness of the preserve. They told jokes. They talked about their plans for Thanksgiving, which was just a few days away. Mike played Stairway to Heaven on his guitar, and everyone fell quiet, listening to the familiar melody drift across the ancient rocks. None of them noticed the vehicle approaching on the gravel road. None of them heard the car doors closing, or the footsteps moving through the darkness toward their fire. None of them had any idea that their lives were about to end, because while these 5 teenagers sat around a bonfire, enjoying what they thought was a safe, innocent night, 3 men were watching them from the shadows. 3 men who had their own plans for the evening. 3 men who saw the firelight and decided to investigate. 3 men who were about to commit one of the most horrific crimes in the history of the Midwest. Their names were Alan Fryer, David Fryer, and James Fryer, brothers. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, only one of the 5 teenagers would still be alive. The Fryer brothers were not strangers to trouble. Alan Fryer was 29 years old, the oldest of the 3. He was a Vietnam War veteran, having served in the army during some of the conflict's most brutal years. Those who knew him said that Alan came back from the war changed, hardened. There was a darkness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He drank heavily, often flew into rages over minor provocations, and had difficulty holding down steady employment. His marriage had fallen apart. He'd been arrested multiple times for assault, disorderly conduct, and theft. By 1973, Alan was living a transient lifestyle, drifting from town to town, staying with family when they'd have him, sleeping in his car when they wouldn't. David Fryer was 24. Unlike his older brother, David had never served in the military. He'd grown up in the same small towns, attended the same schools, but where Alan had once shown promise before Vietnam destroyed him, David had always been trouble. He had a long juvenile record: shoplifting, vandalism, fighting. As an adult, the charges grew more serious: burglary, assault with a deadly weapon, parole violations. David was on parole that November. Supposed to be checking in regularly with his parole officer. Supposed to be staying out of trouble. He was doing neither. James Fryer was 22, the youngest of the 3 brothers. James was different from his older siblings in many ways. He was quieter, less aggressive, but he was also easily influenced, especially by Alan. James looked up to his older brother with an almost worshipful devotion. Whatever Alan said, James agreed with. Whatever Alan wanted to do, James went along with. Some who knew the family said that James might have turned out differently if he'd been born into another family, if he'd had different role models, if he'd been able to break free from his brother's influence. But he never did. The 3 brothers had been on a crime spree that fall, though spree might be too organized a word for what they were doing. They were opportunistic criminals, breaking into homes when they were drunk and needed money, stealing cars for joyrides. They were violent, unpredictable, and getting worse with each passing week. On November 17, 1973, the Fryer brothers were driving through the Tree State area with no particular destination in mind. They'd been drinking throughout the afternoon and into the evening. Alan was behind the wheel of a beat-up sedan they'd borrowed from a relative who would later report it stolen. David sat in the passenger seat, drinking from a bottle of cheap whiskey. James was in the back, quiet as usual, staring out the window at the dark landscape rolling by. They were armed. Alan had a shotgun, a 12 gauge that he'd taken from a house they'd burglarized 2 weeks earlier. David carried a .22 caliber rifle. James had a handgun, though he was the least comfortable handling it, often checking the safety nervously when his brothers weren't looking. As they drove down the gravel roads near Larchwood, Iowa, they saw something in the distance. A glow firelight. Alan slowed the car. "What's that?" David asked, leaning forward to get a better look. "Looks like a campfire," Alan said. His voice was flat, emotionless. "Want to check it out?" David asked. There was an edge to his voice, a kind of predatory excitement. Alan thought about it for a moment, then nodded. He turned off the main road and headed toward Gitche-Manitou State Preserve. James, in the back seat, said nothing. He never did. The car came to a stop about 100 yards from where the teenagers were gathered. Alan killed the engine and the headlights. For a moment, the three brothers just sat there in the darkness, watching the fire, listening to the distant sound of music and laughter. "How many you think there are?" David asked. "Dunno," Alan replied. "Let's find out." They grabbed their weapons and got out of the car. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the cold ground and the wind. They moved toward the fire slowly, staying in the shadows beyond the ring of firelight. They could see the 5 teenagers now, 4 boys and a girl, sitting around the flames, completely unaware that they were being watched. Alan, David, and James stood there for several minutes, hidden in the darkness, observing. The teenagers looked young, vulnerable, easy targets. Alan felt a familiar stirring, a combination of anger and excitement that he'd felt before, both in Vietnam and in the violent confrontations that had marked his life since returning home. He'd learned that violence could be intoxicating, that there was a kind of power in dominating someone weaker than yourself. David was thinking about the same thing. He'd been in prison long enough to understand predatory behavior, to recognize the weak and the strong, to know when someone was defenseless. And James was just watching his brothers, waiting for Alan to tell him what to do. Finally, Alan spoke in a low whisper. "We're going to rob them." David grinned in the darkness. "And if they don't cooperate?" Alan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The 3 brothers checked their weapons one last time, then stepped out of the shadows and walked toward the fire. Mike Hadrath was the first to notice them. He looked up from his guitar and saw 3 figures approaching from the darkness, silhouetted against the night sky. At first, he thought maybe they were other teenagers coming to join the party, or perhaps park rangers checking to make sure they weren't causing trouble. "Hey," Mike called out, his voice friendly. "You guys here for the fire?" The figures didn't respond. They just kept walking. Getting closer, Stu Bade noticed them next. He stood up, squinting into the darkness beyond the firelight. Something felt wrong. These weren't teenagers. These were grown men. And they were carrying something. "Guns, Mike," Stu said quietly, his voice tense. "They've got guns." The mood around the fire changed instantly. The laughter died. The music stopped. Everyone turned to look at the approaching figures, and a collective chill ran through the group that had nothing to do with the November cold. Sandy Chesky felt her stomach drop. She was 13 years old, and she'd never seen a real gun up close before, except for hunting rifles locked in her father's cabinet. But these men were carrying their weapons openly, pointed forward, and there was something in the way they moved that made her want to run. But where would she run? They were miles from anywhere, surrounded by darkness and empty prairie. Alan Fryer stepped into the light of the fire first. His face was gaunt, unshaven, his eyes cold and empty. He held the shotgun loosely in his hands, the barrel pointed in the general direction of the teenagers. David came next, the rifle cradled in his arms. He was smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who knew he had complete power over a situation. James followed last, the handgun held awkwardly at his side. He wouldn't look directly at any of the teenagers. He kept his eyes on the ground or on his brothers. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the wind moving through the trees. Then Alan broke the silence. "Evening," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel scraping against metal. "Nice night for a fire." Mike tried to keep his voice steady. "Yeah, we're just hanging out. Not causing any trouble?" We can see that, Alan said. He took a few steps closer, and the teenagers instinctively backed up. Problem is we need a few things. So you're going to give us your money, your car keys, and anything else worth taking. Do that, and nobody gets hurt. Roger Essam, the quiet one who'd been poking at the fire just minutes earlier, spoke up. We don't have much money. Maybe $20 between all of us. David laughed, a harsh sound. Then I guess you better hand over that $20, shouldn't you? Stubade was trying to think, trying to figure out how to de-escalate the situation. These men were clearly dangerous, probably drunk or high, and they had weapons. The smart thing to do was give them whatever they wanted and hope they'd leave. Stu said, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of peace. No problem. We'll give you whatever you want. Just be cool, okay? Alan's expression didn't change. All of you? The 5 teenagers did as they were told. Mike pulled out his wallet, which contained $7 and his driver's license. Stu had $11 and some change. Roger had $3. Dana, the 14-year-old, had no money at all. His parents hadn't given him any, assuming his older brother would pay for anything he needed. Sandy reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out 2 crumpled dollar bills. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped them. The Fryer brothers watched as the teenagers placed their meager funds on a flat rock near the fire. $23 total. David picked up the money and counted it, then looked at Alan with disgust. $23. That's it. Alan's jaw tightened. He'd been hoping for more, hoping for something that would make this worthwhile. $23 wasn't even enough for a decent bottle of whiskey. What about jewelry? David asked, turning back to the teenagers. Watch your rings. Mike held up his wrist, showing he wasn't wearing a watch. Neither was Stu or Roger. Dana was too young to own anything valuable. Sandy had a small silver bracelet that grandmother had given her for her last birthday. It was her most treasured possession. Give it here, David said, gesturing toward her wrist with the rifle. Sandy's eyes filled with tears, but she unclasped the bracelet and handed it over. David barely glanced at it before shoving it into his pocket. Car keys, Alan demanded. Stu pulled the keys to his father's car from his jeans pocket and tossed them onto the rock with the money. Alan looked at the pathetic pile of their haul and felt his anger rising. This was supposed to be easy money. These were just kids, they should have had more. Wallets should have been fat with cash from part-time jobs and allowances. There should have been watches, expensive jackets, maybe even drugs they could steal and sell. But there was nothing. Just $23, a cheap bracelet and car keys. David could see his brother's mood darkening. He'd seen that look before, seen what happened when Alan got that expression on his face. David felt a thrill of anticipation. Maybe we should take the girl, David said suddenly, his eyes fixed on Sandy. The words hung in the air like poison. Sandy's face went white. She took a step backward, but there was nowhere to go. The fire was behind her, and the Fryer brothers were in front of her. Stu moved instinctively, stepping between Sandy and the armed men. Hey, leave her alone. You got what you wanted. Just take it and go. Alan's eyes narrowed. He didn't like being told what to do. He especially didn't like being told what to do by some punk kid who couldn't even grow a proper beard. Did I ask for your opinion? Alan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. We gave you everything, Mike said, trying to sound calm even though his heart was hammering in his chest. The money, the keys, everything. Just take it and leave us alone. But Alan wasn't interested in leaving anymore. Something had shifted in his mind. He looked at these 5 teenagers, healthy, young, privileged kids with their whole lives ahead of them, and he felt a wave of resentment so strong it was almost overwhelming. These kids had never served in Vietnam. They'd never seen their friends blown apart by mines or burned alive by napalm. They'd never spent time in prison, never been denied jobs because of their criminal record, never had to sleep in their car because no one would rent to them. These kids had it easy, and Alan Fryer hated them for it. On your knees, Alan said suddenly, raising the shotgun to his shoulder. The teenagers looked at him in confusion and fear. What? Mike asked. I said get on your fucking knees, Alan shouted. The sudden volume made everyone flinch, David was smiling wider now. He understood what was happening. They weren't just robbing these kids anymore. They were going to teach them a lesson, maybe hurt them a little, show them what real fear felt like. James, standing behind his brothers, felt his stomach twist. He had a bad feeling about where this was going, but he said nothing. He never did. "Come on, man," Roger said, his voice pleading. "We did what you asked. We gave you everything. Please just let us go. On your knees." Alan punctuated each word by pumping the shotgun chambering around with a sharp, mechanical sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet of the preserve. Slowly, reluctantly, the 5 teenagers sank to their knees in the cold dirt. Sandy was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. Dana was shaking not just from the cold but from pure terror. Mike kept his eyes on Alan, trying to read the man's intentions, trying to figure out if there was anything he could say what was about to happen. Stu was calculating distances, angles. If he rushed the men, could he knock the shotgun away? Could he give the others time to run? But even as the thought formed, he knew it was hopeless. There were 3 armed men and 5 unarmed teenagers. The math didn't work. Alan walked slowly around the fire, looking at each of the teenagers kneeling before him. He felt powerful, in control. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he mattered. "You know what your problem is," Alan said, his voice conversational now, almost friendly. "You've had it too easy. You don't know what the real world is like. You don't know what it's like to suffer. We're sorry," Dana said, his voice small and frightened. "We didn't mean to." "Shut up," Alan snapped. "I didn't say you could talk." David laughed. He was enjoying this. He moved closer to Sandy, who was kneeling at the end of the line. "Maybe we should take her with us," he said again. "Have some fun." "No," Sandy whispered. "Please." "No." Stu's hands balled into fists. "Don't touch her." Alan whirled on Stu. "You keep talking, I'm gonna put a hole in you. Understand?" Stu glared at him but said nothing. For several long minutes, the Fryer brothers just stood there drinking smoking cigarettes, watching the teenagers kneel in the dirt. They were savoring the power. The fear they were causing was a high better than any drug. Then Alan made a decision. "On your feet," he ordered. "We're going for a walk." The teenagers stood up slowly, their legs stiff from kneeling. Mike spoke up, trying one more time to reason with their captors. "Where are we going?" "You'll see," Alan said. He gestured toward the darkness beyond the fire with the shotgun. "Start walking. That way." The group began moving away from the warmth and light of the fire, out into the cold darkness of the preserve. The Fryer brothers followed behind them, guns ready, herding them like cattle toward slaughter. They walked for about 10 minutes, moving deeper into the preserve, farther from any roads or houses. The only light came from the moon, which cast everything in shades of silver and black. They could hear the river in the distance, and somewhere an owl hooted, a lonely sound in the vast emptiness. Finally, Alan told them to stop. They were in a small clearing surrounded by bare trees and prairie grass. The ancient Sioux quartzite formations loomed nearby, dark and silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. "Everyone on your knees again," Alan commanded. They obeyed. Sandy was sobbing openly now, unable to control her fear. Dana was crying too, trying to be brave but failing. Mike, Stu, and Roger exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. They all knew in that moment that they were going to die. There was no reasoning with these men. There was no escape. This was the end, but even knowing that, they couldn't quite believe it. Because things like this didn't happen in places like this, to people like them. This was the kind of thing you saw in horror movies, not real life. Not in Iowa. Not in a place called Gitche Manitou. A place whose name meant Great Spirit. A place that was supposed to be sacred. Alan positioned himself behind Mike Hadrath, the 18-year-old boy with the gentle smile and dreams of becoming a musician. He raised the shotgun, pressing the barrel against the back of Mike's head. Mike felt the cold metal against his skull and closed his eyes. He thought about his parents, about how devastated they would be. He thought about his guitar, about all the songs he'd never get to play. He thought about how unfair it was that his life was ending before it had really begun. "Please," Mike whispered. "Please don't do this." Alan pulled the trigger. The blast shattered the night silence. Mike Hadrat's body pitched forward and collapsed onto the frozen ground. Blood spread out in a dark pool beneath him, steaming in the cold air. The other 4 teenagers screamed. The sound of the shotgun blast echoed across the preserve, rolling over the ancient rocks and disappearing into the vast darkness of the prairie. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The 4 surviving teenagers stared in horror at Mike's lifeless body, their minds unable to process what had just happened. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But it was. Stuart Bade was kneeling next to where Mike had been just seconds before. He felt something warm splatter across his face and realized with nauseating clarity that it was his best friend's blood. Stu's mind was screaming at him to run, to fight, to do something, but his body wouldn't respond. He was paralyzed by shock and terror. Beside him, his younger brother Dana was hyperventilating, making small whimpering sounds like a wounded animal. Roger Essam had gone completely silent, his face drained of all color, his eyes wide and unblinking. And Sandy Chesky was screaming, a high-pitched wail of pure horror that seemed to go on and on. David Fryer stepped forward and backhanded Sandy across the face. "Shut up," he snarled. The blow stunned her into silence. She tasted blood in her mouth where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. Her ears were ringing, both from the slap and from the proximity to the gunshot. She couldn't hear anything except a high, and the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Alan Fryer chambered another round in the shotgun, the mechanical sound impossibly loud in the sudden quiet. He felt nothing, no remorse, not even satisfaction, just emptiness. The same emptiness he'd felt in Vietnam when he'd killed enemy soldiers. The same emptiness he'd felt in bar fights when he'd hurt people. Violence had become so routine to him that it no longer registered as something significant. He moved to stand behind Stuart Bade. Stu felt the barrel of the shotgun press against the back of his head, in the exact same spot where Mike had felt it just moments before. Everything became very clear in that instant. Stu thought about his parents, about how his mother would react when she learned that both of her sons had been murdered in the same night. He thought about all the basketball games he'd never play, the college he'd never attend, the life he'd never live. And he thought about his little brother, kneeling just a few feet away, probably about to die too. "I'm sorry, Dana," Stu whispered. "I'm so sorry I brought you here." Those were the last words Stuart Bade ever spoke. Alan pulled the trigger. The second blast was just as loud as the first, just as final. Stu's body crumpled forward, falling across Mike's corpse in a grotesque heap. Blood and brain matter sprayed outward, some of it hitting Dana, who was kneeling directly beside his brother. Dana felt his brother's blood, warm and wet, splash across his face and neck. He looked down and saw Stu's lifeless eyes staring back at him, empty and glazed. Something broke inside Dana Bade in that moment. Some fundamental part of his psyche that couldn't reconcile what was happening with what the world was supposed to be like. His brother, his protector, his hero, was dead, murdered right next to him. Dana opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. He was beyond screaming, beyond rational thought. He was 14 years old, and his entire understanding of reality had just shattered. Alan moved methodically down the line of kneeling teenagers. There was no rush, no urgency. David and James stood back, watching, their weapons ready in case any of the kids tried to run. But none of them did. They were too shocked, too terrified, too broken. Alan positioned himself behind Roger Essam. Roger, the quiet one. The one who was good with engines, the one who'd planned to join the military. Roger, who had his whole life mapped out, who talked about duty and honor and serving his country. Roger was praying. He wasn't religious. His family only went to church on Christmas and Easter. But in that moment, facing certain death, he found himself whispering the Lord's Prayer, the only prayer he could remember from childhood Sunday school classes. "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." He didn't get to finish. The third blast came, and Roger Essam fell forward into the cold dirt, his prayer cut short. His dreams of military service ended before they could begin. 3 down, 2 to go. Dana Bade and Sandra Chesky knelt side by side, the only ones left. They were both crying now, tears streaming down their faces, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. They knew what was coming. They just watched 3 people they cared about get executed one by one. They knew there was no mercy here, no escape, no last-minute rescue. This was how their lives were going to end, kneeling in the dirt in a place called Gitche, Manitou, murdered by strangers for no reason at all. Alan stood behind Dana, the 14-year-old boy who wasn't supposed to be there that night. The boy whose parents had been hesitant to let him go, but had ultimately trusted his older brother to keep him safe. The boy who'd been excited to be included with the older kids, who'd felt so grown up just an hour ago. Dana could feel the shotgun barrel pressing against his skull. He thought about his parents, about how they'd be sitting at home right now, probably watching television, completely unaware that both of their sons were dying. He thought about his dog Rex, who would wait by the door for Dana to come home, not understanding why he never did. He thought about the baseball game he was supposed to play next week, the math test he'd studied so hard for, the girl at school he had a crush on but had been too shy to talk to. All of it was ending. All of it was being taken away. "Please," Dana whispered, his voice barely audible. "I want my mom." Alan Fryer pulled the trigger. The fourth blast echoed across Gitche, Manitou. Dana Bade's small body collapsed onto the ground next to his brother's. The two of them lay there in the dirt, side by side in death as they had been in life. 4 bodies now. 4 young lives extinguished in the space of a few minutes. 4 families who would never be whole again. And then there was one. Sandra Chesky was the last one kneeling. She was still alive, though she couldn't understand why. She'd watched 4 people die. She'd felt their blood spray across her. She'd heard their final words, their prayers, their pleas. She'd seen the light go out of their eyes, and now it was her turn. Alan Fryer stood behind the 13-year-old girl, his shotgun raised. But for the first time that night, he hesitated. Something about killing a young girl felt different than killing teenage boys. Not different enough to stop him. Alan Fryer was long past the point where moral considerations held any weight, but different enough to make him pause. David Fryer noticed his brother's hesitation and stepped forward. "What are you waiting for?" he asked. "Do it." But Alan was thinking. She could identify them. She was a witness. She had to die. And yet, "Please, Sandy." She couldn't see who was behind her, couldn't see the gun, but she could feel its presence, could sense death hovering over her like a dark cloud. "Please, I won't tell anyone, I promise. Just let me go. Please." "She's just a kid." James Fryer spoke up suddenly. It was the first time he'd said anything since they'd approached the fire. His voice was quiet and uncertain. "Maybe we should—" "Shut up, James," David snapped. "She saw everything. She's got to go." Alan was still thinking. The girl was small, young, vulnerable. If they let her go, she'd run straight to the police. They'd be caught within hours. But if they killed her, there would be no witnesses. Alan made his decision. He pulled the trigger. The blast caught Sandy in the back of the head, but at the last second, either through some instinct or just random chance, she'd started to fall forward. The shotgun pellets that should have killed her instantly instead tore through the back of her skull at an angle, missing her brainstem. Sandy felt an explosion of pain unlike anything she'd ever experienced. It was as if someone had hit her head with a sledgehammer while simultaneously setting her skull on fire. She fell forward, her face hitting the cold ground, blood pouring from the wound in her head. But she was still conscious. Through the blood and the pain and the terror, some part of Sandra Chesky's brain was still functioning. Some primal survival instinct took over, telling her to play dead, to stay absolutely still, to not make a sound. So that's what she did. She lay there in the dirt, her face pressed against the cold earth, blood pooling around her head, mixing with the blood of her 4 dead friends. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She didn't make a sound. She played dead. Alan looked down at the girl's motionless body and assumed she was dead just like the others. He couldn't see her chest rising and falling. Her winter jacket was too thick, and her breathing was too shallow. He couldn't hear her heartbeat over the ringing in his ears from the shotgun blasts. As far as Alan Fryer was concerned, all 5 teenagers were dead. "Let's go," Alan said to his brothers. He felt nothing. No triumph, no remorse, no excitement. just emptiness and a vague sense of impatience. They'd wasted enough time here. David took one last look at the bodies sprawled in the clearing, then nodded. "What about the car?" he asked, holding up Stu's car keys. "Take it," Alan said. "We'll dump it later." The three brothers walked away from the killing field, leaving 5 bodies, or what they thought were 5 bodies, lying in the darkness. They made their way back toward the bonfire, which was still burning, the flames casting dancing shadows on the ancient rocks. When they reached the fire, David kicked dirt on it, partially extinguishing the flames. No point in advertising what had happened here, not until they were long gone. Alan grabbed Mike's guitar, which was leaning against a rock, and smashed it against the Sioux quartzite, shattering it into pieces. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was one final act of destruction. One last way to erase the evidence of these kids' existence. Then the 3 brothers walked to where Stu's father's car was parked. David got behind the wheel, Alan took the passenger seat, and James climbed in the back. They left their own vehicle where it was. They'd come back for it later. Or maybe they wouldn't. David started the engine, and they drove away from Gitche Manitou State Preserve, leaving behind the worst crime scene in the history of the Tree State area. The night fell silent again. The fire burned low, just embers now. The wind moved through the bare trees. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, its voice lonely and mournful. And in the clearing, among the bodies of 4 murdered teenagers, Sandra Chesky lay perfectly still, blood streaming from the wound in her head, fighting with everything she had to stay conscious, to stay quiet, to stay alive. She didn't know if the men were really gone. She didn't know if they were watching from the darkness, waiting to see if anyone moved. She didn't know if they would come back. So she waited. Minutes passed. They felt like hours. The cold was seeping into her body, making her shiver uncontrollably, but she forced herself to stay still. The pain in her head was unbearable. A white-hot agony that made it hard to think, hard to focus on anything except the need to survive. She could hear things now that the ringing in her ears had subsided. The wind, the river, the soft crackling of the dying fire in the distance. And something else. Something that made her blood run cold. Footsteps. Someone was coming back. Sandy's heart hammered in her chest. They'd returned to finish the job. They were going to check the bodies, and when they found her still breathing, they were going to kill her for real this time. But she couldn't run. She was too weak, too disoriented. The world was spinning around her, and she wasn't even sure which direction was which. If she tried to stand, she'd probably just fall over, and then they'd definitely know she was alive. So she stayed still, her face pressed against the cold ground, blood pooling beneath her, and waited for death to come. The footsteps got closer. She could hear breathing now, heavy and labored. Whoever it was, they were standing right next to her. "This is it, Sandy, I die." But then a voice spoke, and it wasn't one of the men who'd killed her friends. "Oh my God."
Oh my God, what happened here?
It was a man's voice, older, shocked, horrified. Sandy wanted to cry out, to say that she was alive, that she needed help, but she was terrified that the killers might still be nearby, might hear her if she made a sound. The man knelt down beside her. She could feel his presence, could smell cigarette smoke and aftershave. He reached out and touched her neck, checking for a pulse. "This one's still alive," the man said, and Sandy realized he wasn't alone. There was someone else with him. "Jesus Christ," another voice said, younger, also male. "Should we call for help?" The first man said. "She's bleeding bad. We need to get her to a hospital now." Sandy felt hands lifting her, gentle but urgent. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through her head, and she couldn't hold back a moan. "It's okay," the first man said, his voice kind despite the fear she could hear in it. "We've got you." Sandy wanted to believe him, but she'd already learned that night that the world wasn't okay, that safety was an illusion, that terrible things could happen to innocent people for no reason at all. But she was alive. Against all odds, against all probability, she was still alive. The men, local farmers who'd been driving home from a neighbor's house and had seen the glow of the fire and decided to investigate, carried Sandy to their truck. They laid her in the back seat as gently as they could, one of them pressing his jacket against the wound on her head to try to stop the bleeding. "What about the others?" the younger man asked, looking back toward the clearing where 4 bodies lay. The older man shook his head grimly. "They're gone. Nothing we can do for them now. But this girl, we can still save this girl." He got behind the wheel and started the engine. The truck roared to life, and they pulled away from Gitche Manitou State Preserve, racing through the darkness toward the nearest hospital. In the back seat, Sandy drifted in and out of consciousness. She could hear the men talking, their voices urgent but distant, as if she were hearing them through water. She could feel the truck bouncing over the rough gravel roads, each bump sending fresh jolts of pain through her skull. She thought about Mike, about his gentle smile and his guitar. She thought about Stu and his boisterous laugh. She thought about Roger, quiet and reliant, just a kid too young to die. They were dead, all of them, and she should be dead too, but she wasn't. The truck pulled up to the emergency entrance of McKinnon Hospital in Sioux Falls 45 minutes later. The older farmer jumped out and ran inside, shouting for help. Within seconds, medical personnel came rushing out with a gurney. They lifted Sandy out to it and wheeled her inside, moving fast, calling out medical terminology she didn't understand. She caught glimpses of bright fluorescent lights, white walls, concerned faces looking down at her. A doctor appeared above her, his face calm but serious. "You're in the hospital," he said clearly. "You've been shot. We're going to take care of name." "Sandra," she whispered. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, weak and distant. "Sandra Chesky." "Okay, Sandra. Can you tell me what happened?" Sandy said, and then the tears came, hot and overwhelming. "They killed all of them. Mike and Stu and Roger and Dana, they killed them all." "Who killed Dra? Who did this?" But before she could answer, the world went dark, and Sandra Chesky lost consciousness. She would wake up the next morning in a hospital bed, her head wrapped in bandages, her body broken but alive. She would wake up to find her parents beside her, crying and holding her hands, thanking God that their daughter had survived. She would wake up to learn that she was the sole survivor of what was already being called the Gitche Manitou Massacre, the worst mass murder in Iowa history. She would wake up knowing that while her body might heal, some part of her would be forever changed by what she'd witnessed tonight. But that was tomorrow. For now, as the doctors worked frantically to save her life, as nurses called her parents to tell them their daughter was alive but critical, as police officers received the first horrifying reports of what had been found at Gitche Manitou, Sandra Chesky drifted in the darkness, hovering between life and death, holding on by the thinnest of threads. She was 13 years old. She was supposed to be safe. She was supposed to be protected. But the world had shown her a truth that no child should ever have to learn: that monsters are real, that evil exists, and that sometimes the innocent suffer for no reason at all. The police arrived at Gitche Manitou State Preserve at 20:47 a.m. on Sunday, November 18, 1973. The call had come in about 40 minutes earlier from McKinnon Hospital. A girl had been brought in with a gunshot wound to the head, claiming that 4 other teenagers had been murdered at the preserve. At first, the dispatcher thought it might be a prank or a misunderstanding. Mass murders didn't happen in places like this, to people like this. But when the farmer hooted the girl and backed up her story, describing what he'd seen at the scene, the dispatcher's blood ran cold. Within minutes, every available officer in the Treek State area was being mobilized. Sheriff Doug Vonder Wild of Lyon County, Iowa, led the initial response. He was a veteran lawman, had been sheriff for 12 years, and thought he'd seen everything there was to see in rural law enforcement. Bar fights, domestic disputes, the occasional burglary or assault. Nothing had prepared him for what he was about to find. His patrol car, followed by 3 others, turned onto the gravel road leading to Gitche Manitou. Their headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating bare trees and open prairie. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. It was hard to believe that something terrible had happened here. But as they got closer to the preserve, they saw it, the glow of dying embers from a fire, and beyond it, illuminated by the moonlight, shapes on the ground that looked like bundles of discarded clothes. except they weren't clothes. Sheriff Vanderwilt brought his car to a stop about 50 yards from the clearing. He got out slowly, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon. The other officers did the same, fanning out, their flashlights sweeping across the scene. The smell hit them first. Blood, lots of it, mixed with the cold November air. It was a smell that Sheriff Vanderwilt had encountered before, at accident scenes and the occasional hunting mishap, but never like this. Never this much. They approached the clearing carefully, their flashlight beams revealing more details with each step. Empty soda cans, a broken guitar, blankets spread on the ground, the remnants of a campfire. It looked like a normal teenage gathering, the kind of thing that happened every weekend across America. Except for the bodies, Sheriff Vanderwilt saw the fur and stopped dead in his tracks. A teenage boy lying face down, the back of his head blown apart by a shotgun blast at close range. Blood had pooled beneath him, dark and thick, already starting to congeal in the cold. Jesus Christ! One of the deputies whispered behind him. They moved forward and found the second body. Another teenage boy lying partially across the first. Same cause of death. Point-blank shotgun wound to the back of the head. Then the third. And the fourth. 4 bodies, all teenage boys, all executed in the same manner. All shot from behind while kneeling. Based on the positioning of the bodies and the blood spatter patterns, Sheriff Vanderwilt had served in World War II. He'd seen combat, seen death, seen young men cut down in the prime of life. But this was different. This was cold-blooded murder. This was execution. These weren't soldiers on a battlefield, they were kids at a campfire. Secure the scene, he ordered, his voice rough with emotion. Nobody touches anything until we get forensics out here. And someone call the coroner. Tell him to bring body bags. Tell him to bring 4. One of the younger deputies moved away from the group and vomited into the grass. Nobody blamed him. As the officers worked to secure the crime scene, setting up perimeter tape and taking preliminary photographs, Sheriff Vanderwilt stood in the center of the clearing, looking at the 4 dead boys, trying to make sense of what had happened here. The girl in the hospital had said there were 5 of them, 5 teenagers, which meant one was missing. Sheriff, one of the deputies called out, "We found something." Vanderwilt walked over to where the deputy was standing, shining his flashlight on the ground. There was more blood here, a substantial amount, and drag marks leading away from where the 4 boys had been killed. "Looks like someone crawled away," the deputy said. "Maybe the 5th victim." She said there were 4 boys. Vanderwilt said. "So the 5th must have been her. She must have been shot here and then crawled or was dragged away. And somehow she survived. It seemed impossible. Nobody survives a close-range shotgun blast to the head. But the evidence was there: blood, drag marks, and one survivor in the hospital who by all rights should be dead. Anything else?" The deputy nodded. "Tire tracks. Looks like 2 vehicles. One set of tracks coming in and parking over by those rocks, and another set looks fresher. That goes right up to where the kids parked and then drives away. The killers took one of the victims' cars." Vanderwilt said. It wasn't a question. The pieces were starting to come together. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was deliberate. The killers had come to the preserve, had found these kids, had taken what little they had, and then had executed them. And then they'd stolen their car and driven away. As dawn began to break over Gitche-Manitou State Preserve, more officers arrived, along with crime scene technicians and the county coroner. The ancient Sioux quartzite rocks, which had witnessed countless sunrises over millions of years, now bore witness to one of the darkest crimes in the region's history. The coroner, Dr. Robert Peschong, arrived around 50:00 a.m. He was a middle-aged man, balding, with wire-rimmed glasses and a professional demeanor that rarely cracked. But when he saw the 4 bodies laid out in the clearing, his composure slipped. "My God," he said quietly. "They're just kids." He moved from body to body, making preliminary examinations, taking notes, confirming what everyone already knew: 4 victims. All male, all teenagers, all killed by shotgun blasts to the back of the head at close range. Execution style. The first victim was identified from his wallet as Michael Hadrath, 18 years old, from Canton, South Dakota. The second was Stuart Bade, 17 years old, from Larchwood, Iowa. The third was Roger Essam, 17 years old, also from the local area. The fourth was Dana Bate, 14 years old, Stuart's younger brother. 4 families were about to have their lives destroyed. 4 sets of parents were about to receive the worst news any parent could hear. 4 communities were about to be shaken to their cores. Sheriff Vander Wilt stood back and watched as the bodies were photographed, measured, and finally placed into body bags. The sun was fully up now, and in the daylight the scene was even more horrific. Blood was everywhere, on the ground, on the rocks, splattered on the bare trees. Shell casings from a shotgun littered the area. The broken remains of a guitar lay scattered near the fire pit. Evidence of young lives ended violently and senselessly. "Sheriff," one of the forensic techs called out, "we found something you should see." Vander Wilt walked over. The tech was holding up a small plastic evidence bag. Inside was a silver bracelet, cheap costume jewelry, the kind a young girl might wear. "Found it on the ground near where the girl must have been shot," the tech said. "Must have fallen off during the struggle or when she was shot." Vander Wilt took the bag and looked at the bracelet. Such a small thing, such an insignificant object. But to Sandra Chesky it had probably been precious. And now it was evidence in a mass murder investigation. He pocketed the bag and turned to address the assembled officers. "Listen up," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing. "We have one survivor in the hospital. She saw everything. She can identify the killers, which means those killers know she's alive, and they're going to want to shut her up. I want a guard posted at that hospital 24/7. Nobody gets near that girl except medical personnel and immediate family." "Understood," the officers nodded. "We're also looking for a stolen vehicle," Vander Wilt continued. "A 1965 Chevrolet Impala, green, belonging to the Bade family. Put out an APB. Whoever took that car is our killer, or killers. The girl said there were 3 of them, so we're looking for 3 suspects, all male, all armed and extremely dangerous." As the officers dispersed to begin their assigned tasks, Sheriff Vander Wilt took one last look at the crime scene. The bodies had been removed, but the blood remained, dark stains on the earth that would probably still be visible come spring. This place, this beautiful preserve with its ancient rocks and its sacred Native American heritage, had been forever tainted by violence. Gitche Manitou, the Great Spirit, had witnessed an act of profound evil, and somewhere out there 3 men were driving around in a stolen car, believing they'd gotten away with murder. They had no idea that one 13-year-old girl was about to make sure they paid for what they'd done. Sandra Chesky opened her eyes to a world of white. White ceiling tiles, white walls. Everything was bright and sterile and unfamiliar. For a moment, she couldn't remember when she was or how she'd gotten there. Her head felt like it was filled with cotton, her thoughts slow and disconnected. Then the pain hit her. It started at the back of her skull and radiated outward in waves, a throbbing, burning agony that made her gasp. She tried to reach up to touch her head, but her arm felt impossibly heavy, and there were tubes attached to it, clear plastic lines running to bags of fluid hanging beside the bed. "Sandy. Oh, thank God. Thank God you're awake." Her mother's face appeared above her, tear-stained and exhausted. Her father was there too, standing just behind her mother, his eyes red and swollen from crying. They both looked like they'd aged 10 years overnight. "Mom." Sandy's voice came out as a hoarse whisper, barely recognizable as her own. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." Her mother took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You're in the hospital. You're safe now. You're going to be okay." The memories came flooding back then, crashing over her like a wave. The bonfire, the 3 men with guns, the sound of shotgun blasts, Mike falling, Stu falling, Dana, all of them falling. One by one, their lives snuffed out in seconds. "They killed them," Sandy whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, they killed everyone. They're all dead." Her mother's face crumpled, and she began to cry in earnest. Her father stepped forward, placing a hand on Sandy's shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "We know, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The police told us. But you're alive. You survived. That's all that matters right now." A nurse appeared in the doorway, having heard voices from the hallway. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and a professional smile. "Welcome back, Sandra," she said warmly. How are you feeling? My head hurts, Sandy said. I'm sure it does. You took quite a blow. The doctor will be in shortly to check on you, but I can give you something for the pain if you'd like. Sandy nodded, then immediately regretted it as the movement sent fresh spikes of agony through her skull. The nurse administered pain medication through the IV line, and within minutes, Sandy felt the edges of the pain soften, becoming more manageable. The world took on a slightly hazy quality, and she felt herself starting to drift. Don't let me fall asleep, she said suddenly, gripping her mother's hand tighter. When I close my eyes, I see them. I see what happened. It's okay to sleep, honey, her mother said gently. You're safe here. Those men can't hurt you anymore. But Sandy wasn't so sure about that. Those men were still out there somewhere, and they thought she was dead. What would happen when they found out she'd survived? Would they come looking for her? Would they try to finish what they'd started? As if reading her thoughts, her father spoke up. There's a police officer right outside your door, Sandy. Nobody's getting in here except doctors and nurses and us. You're protected. A doctor entered the room then, a tall man with graying hair and a serious expression. He introduced himself as Dr. Mitchell, the neurosurgeon who'd operated on Sandy during the night. You're very lucky to be alive, young lady, he said, reviewing her chart. The shot and pellets entered the back of your skull at an angle, a few millimeters in a different direction, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. As it is, we were able to remove most of the pellets, but some are too deep to extract safely. You'll carry them with you for the rest of your life. Will I be okay? Sandy asked. You should make a full recovery, Dr. Mitchell said. There may be some scarring, and you'll likely experience headaches for a while, but your brain function appears to be normal. No major damage to the critical areas. It's really quite remarkable. After the doctor left, a different kind of visitor arrived. Sheriff Doug Vander Wilt stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his expression grave. Miss Chesky, he said formally. I'm Sheriff Vander Wilt. I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions about what happened last night. Do you feel up to talking? Sandy's parents started to object, saying she needed rest, but Sandy interrupted them. It's okay, she said. I want to help. I want you to catch them. The sheriff pulled a chair a bed and took out a small notepad. Take your time, he said gently. Just tell me everything you remember, starting from when you arrived at the preserve. And so Sandra Chesky, 13 years old, heavily medicated and traumatized beyond measure, began to recount the worst night of her life. She told the sheriff about the bonfire, about sitting around the fire with her friends, about the 3 men who'd appeared out of the darkness with guns. The sheriff asked. Sandy closed her eyes, seeing them again in her mind's eye. The oldest one was tall, maybe 6 feet. Then he had dark hair, kind of messy. His face was hard, mean-looking. He had the shotgun. What about the others? There was another one, maybe mid-20s. He had a rifle. He was shorter than the first one, stockier. He smiled a lot, but it wasn't a nice smile. It was like he was enjoying what was happening. And the third man, he was younger, early 20s maybe. He didn't talk much. He just stood there watching. He had a handgun, but he seemed nervous about it, like he wasn't sure what to do. Sheriff Vander Wilt wrote everything down, nodding encouragingly. You're doing great, Sandra. Did they say anything? Any names or where they were from? Sandy thought hard, trying to remember through the fog of medication and trauma. The oldest one. The other 2 called him something. Alan. Something like that. The sheriff's pen stopped moving. Alan.
I think so.
And the young one. One of them said his name, James. I'm pretty sure it was James. What about the third one? Sandy shook her head, then winced at the pain. I don't remember. They didn't say his name. Or, if they did, I did wonderfully. The sheriff paused, choosing his next words carefully. Sandra, I need to ask you about what happened after they took your money and belongings. Can you tell me about that? Sandy's eyes filled with tears again. This was the part she didn't want to remember, the part that played over and over in her mind like a horrible movie she couldn't turn off. But she told him. She told him about being forced to kneel, about being marched away from the fire into the darkness. She told him about the first shot, about watching Mike fall, about Stu and Roger and Dana. Each one killed in turn while she waited for her own death. And then he stood behind me, Sandy whispered. I felt the gun against my head, just like the others had. I thought I was going to die. I thought that was it. But you survived, the sheriff said gently. I don't know how. I remember the shot and the pain and falling, but I was still awake, still conscious. I could hear them talking, and I knew if they realized I was alive, they'd shoot me again. So I just stayed still. I played dead. That was very smart, Sandra. Your quick thinking saved your life. I wish it could have saved them too, Sandy said, her voice breaking. I wish I'd done something. Fought back or screamed or run or anything. Maybe if I had, they'd still be alive. No, the sheriff said firmly. If you'd done any of those things, you'd be dead too. There was nothing you could have done. 5 unarmed teenagers against 3 armed men. The only reason you're alive is because you stayed calm and played dead. Don't you ever blame yourself for surviving. But Sandy would blame herself. She would blame herself for the rest of her life. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with the sheriff asking detailed questions about the timeline, about what the men were wearing, about the weapons they carried, about the vehicle they'd arrived in. Sandy answered everything she could, though some details were fuzzy, lost in the trauma and terror of the experience. Finally, the sheriff closed his notepad and stood up. You've been incredibly brave, Sandra. The information you've given me is going to help us catch these men. I promise you, we will find them, and they will pay for what they've done. After the sheriff left, Sandy's parents wanted her to rest, but she couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her friends dying. She heard the shotgun blasts. She felt the cold barrel against her skull. Can I watch TV? She asked. I don't want to be alone with my thoughts right now. Her mother turned on the small television mounted on the wall, flipping through channels until she found something innocuous, a rerun of I Love Lucy. The canned laughter felt obscene in the context of what Sandy had just lived through. But it was better than silence. Outside Sandy's hospital room, Sheriff Vander Wilt stood in the hallway, talking quietly with the officer he'd posted as a guard. Nobody gets in except medical staff, her parents, and law enforcement, he said. And I mean nobody. If anyone tries, you call for backup immediately. These men are desperate and dangerous. Yes, sir, the officer said. Vander Wilt headed back to his office, his mind racing. He had names now, Alan and James. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had an hour ago. He'd start running those names against known criminals in the area, looking for matches. When he arrived at the Lyon County Sheriff's Office, he found it buzzing with activity. Officers from multiple jurisdictions had converged to help with the investigation. The FBI had been notified and was sending agents. The media had gotten wind of the story, and reporters were already gathering outside. Vander Wilt called a meeting of all the investigating officers. They gathered in the conference room, a somber group of men who all looked like they'd aged overnight. Here's what we know, Vander Wilt said, standing at the front of the room. For victims, all teenagers, all shot execution style at Gitche Manitou State Preserve sometime between 7 and 9 p.m. last night. One survivor, Sandra Chesky, 13 years old, who miraculously survived a shotgun blast to the head. He paused, letting that sink in. Miss Chesky has provided descriptions of 3 male suspects. The oldest is named Alan, early 30s, tall and thin. The middle one we don't have a name for yet, mid-20s, shorter and stockier. The youngest is James, early 20s. They were armed with a shotgun, a rifle, and a handgun. They stole the 1965 green Chevrolet Impala. One of the deputies raised his hand. Any luck locating the Inda? Not yet, Vander Wilt said. But I want every officer in a 3-state area looking for that car. It's our best lead right now. Another officer spoke up, with the names Alan and James, and the age ranges. I'm thinking this might be the Fryer brothers. The room went quiet. Vander Wilt turned to look at the officer. Say that again. The Fryer brothers, the officer repeated. Alan, David. They're from around here, been in and out of trouble for years. Alan's the oldest, he's 29, David's 24. James is 22. They fit the descriptions. Vander Wilt felt his pulse quicken. Where are they now? Last I heard, they were supposed to be staying with relatives up near Sioux Falls. Alan just got out of the VA hospital a few months back. David's on parole. James has been arrested a couple times for minor stuff but nothing major. Get me everything we have on the Fryer brothers, Vanderwilt ordered. Records, photos, known associates, last known addresses, and find out where they are right now. The room exploded into action. Officers scattered to various tasks, pulling files, making phone calls, coordinating with other departments. Within an hour they had a comprehensive file on the Fryer brothers. Alan Lee Fryer, born March 12, 1944. Vietnam veteran, honorably discharged in 1968 with PTSD, multiple arrests for assault, drunk and disorderly theft. Spent time in psychiatric facilities, known to be violent and unpredictable. David Lee Fryer, born August 3, 1949. Extensive criminal record including burglary, assault with a deadly weapon, parole violations. Currently on parole, supposed to be living with his mother in Sioux Falls. James Ray Fryer, born January 15, 1951. Shorter criminal record than his brothers, mostly minor offenses. Known to follow Alan's lead in everything. And there were photos. Sheriff Vanderwilt took the photos to McKennan Hospital and showed them to Sandra Chesky. Her parents tried to protest, saying she'd been through enough, but Sandy insisted she wanted to help. The sheriff laid out 6 photos on the bed in front of her. The 3 Fryer brothers, plus 3 random men of similar ages as decoys. Sandy's hand trembled as she looked at the photos. Then her finger moved to one of them. "That's him," she said, her voice shaking. "That's the oldest one. The one with the shotgun." It was Alan Fryer. Her finger moved to another photo. "And that's the young one. James." It was James Fryer. Finally, she pointed to the 3rd photo. "That's the other one, the one who wanted to. Who said they should take me with them." "David Fryer." "Are you absolutely certain?" the sheriff asked. Sandy looked up at him, her eyes haunted but determined. "I will never forget their faces for as long as I live. That's them. Those are the men who killed my friends." Sheriff Vanderwilt gathered up the photos and thanked Sandy. As he left the hospital, he was already on his radio, putting out an all-points bulletin. "Be advised, we have 3 suspects in the Gitche Manitou murders. Alan Lee Fryer, age 29, David Lee Fryer, age 24, James Ray Fryer, age 22. All should be considered armed and extremely dangerous. Suspects may be driving a stolen 1965 green Chevrolet Impala. Approach with extreme caution." The hunt for the Fryer brothers had begun. But the Fryer brothers were already making mistakes. After leaving Gitche Manitou State Preserve in the stolen Impala, the 3 brothers had driven aimlessly for a while. Adrenaline and alcohol still coursing through their systems. They'd committed murder, multiple murders, and the reality of what they'd done was beginning to sink in. "We need to dump this car," David said from the driver's seat. "They're going to be looking for it." "Not yet," Alan said. "We drive it a while longer, put some distance between us and that preserve." They drove east, crossing into Minnesota, then south again into Iowa. They stopped at a gas station in Luverne, Minnesota around midnight, using some of the $23 they'd stolen from the teenagers to fill up the tank. The night clerk, a college student named Timothy Morrison who was working the graveyard shift to pay for tuition, would later tell police that 3 rough-looking men had come in around midnight. They'd bought gas, cigarettes, and a bottle of whiskey. The oldest one had been agitated, pacing back and forth while the other 2 browsed the aisles. Morrison had noticed they were driving a green Impala, and had thought it odd that 3 grown men would be in a car like that. It looked like a family vehicle, not the kind of car these guys would drive. But Morrison was a college kid working alone at night, and he knew better than to ask questions. He took their money, gave them their change, and watched them drive away. If he'd known what those men had just done, if he'd known that there were 4 dead teenagers lying in a clearing less than an hour away, he might have called the police. But he didn't know, so he just went back to his textbook, studying for an exam he had on Monday. The Fryer brothers continued driving. Around 2 a.m., they pulled off onto a deserted farm road and abandoned the Impala in a ditch, wiping down the interior to remove fingerprints. They walked 3 miles through the dark to where they'd left their own vehicle near Gitche Manitou, retrieved it, and drove to a motel on the outskirts of Sioux Falls. They checked in using a fake name, paid cash for one night, and holed up in the room, drinking the whiskey they'd bought and trying to figure out their next move. "We should get out of state," David said. "Head west, maybe to Wyoming or Montana. Lay low for a while." "And do what?" Alan asked. "We've got no money. $23 won't get us far." "We could rob a store," James suggested quietly. "Get some cash, then keep moving." Alan considered this. The idea of running appealed to him. They could disappear to the west, change their names, start over. Nobody would know what they'd done. But there was a problem. A problem Alan hadn't mentioned to his brothers yet. The girl. Alan had been replaying the shooting in his mind, and something was nagging at him. When he'd shot the girl, she'd fallen forward, and he'd assumed she was dead like the others. But he hadn't checked. He hadn't felt for a pulse. Hadn't looked closely at the wound. What if she'd survived? What if she was still alive? No, that was impossible. Nobody survives a shotgun blast to the head at close range. She was dead. They were all dead, but the doubt remained eating at him. "We should watch the news," Alan said suddenly. "See if they've found the bodies yet." They turned on the motel room's small television, flipping through channels until they found a local news station. It was mostly infomercials at this hour, but eventually a news brief came on, and there it was, breaking news from Lyon County, Iowa. Police are investigating what they're calling the Gitche Manita Massacre, where 4 teenagers were found shot to death at a state preserve. A 5th teenager, 13-year-old Sandra Chesky, survived the attack and is currently in critical condition at McKennan Hospital in Sioux Falls. Police are asking anyone with information to come forward. The bottom dropped out of Alan's stomach. The girl was alive. She was alive and she was in a hospital and she could identify them. David and James sat frozen, staring at the television screen. "She's alive," David whispered. "I heard." Alan snapped. "She saw us," James said, his voice rising in panic. "She saw our faces. She can tell the police who we are." "Shut up and let me think," Alan growled. But he couldn't think. His mind was racing, panic setting in. If the girl could identify them, they had maybe hours before the police figured out who they were. And once they did, every cop in the Tree State area would be looking for them. "We need to leave," David said. "Right now. Get as far away as possible." But Alan was thinking about something else. "We need to finish what we started." His brothers looked at him in shock. "What?" David asked. "The girl," Alan said. "We need to kill her before she can talk." "Are you insane?" David said. "She's in a hospital. There's going to be cops everywhere. We can't just walk in and shoot her." "Then we don't walk in," Alan said. "Sneak in, late at night, find her room. Put a pillow over her face. Make it look like she died from her injuries." James shook his head. "That's crazy, Alan. There's no way we could pull that off." But Alan was fixated on the idea. The girl was the only witness, the only person who could tie them to the murders. If they eliminated her, there would be no one to identify them, no one to testify against them. They could disappear, and the case would go cold. "We're doing it," Alan said with finality. "Tomorrow night. We'll case the hospital, find out where she is, and when the time is right, we go in and finish the job." David and James exchanged glances. They both knew that arguing with Alan when he got like this was pointless. When Alan made up his mind about something, that was it. "Okay," David said reluctantly. "But if it looks like it's not going to work, we abort and run." "Agreed." Alan nodded. "Agreed." The 3 brothers spent the rest of the night in the motel room, drinking and planning, unaware that their names and photos were already being circulated to every law enforcement agency in the region. The net was closing in. By Sunday afternoon, news of the Gitche Manita Massacre had spread across the country. It was front-page news in every major newspaper. Television stations interrupted their regular programming to provide updates. The story had everything that captured the public's attention: young victims, brutal violence, a miraculous survivor, and killer still at large. The 4 victims' families were devastated. Mike Hedrath's parents learned of their son's death when police officers arrived at their door early Sunday morning. Mrs. Hedrath collapsed when she heard the news, and Mr. Hedrath, a stoic farmer who rarely showed emotion, broke down sobbing. Their only child was gone, murdered for no reason, his dreams of becoming a musician forever silenced. The Bade family's grief was compounded by the fact that they'd lost 2 sons in one night. Mr. and Mrs. Bade had 6 children, and now 2 of them were dead. The surviving siblings were inconsolable. Their mother kept saying over and over, "I should never have let them go. I should have said no." Their father sat in stunned silence, unable to process that both Stuart and Dana were gone. Roger Essom's parents received the news with quiet devastation. Roger had been their rock, the responsible one, the child they never had to worry about. The fact that he'd been murdered while doing nothing wrong, while just trying to have an innocent night with friends, was incomprehensible to them. By Monday morning, the funerals were being planned. The communities of Canton, Larchwood, and the surrounding areas were in shock. Churches were packed with people seeking comfort and answers. Why had this happened? How could something so evil occur in their safe, quiet corner of the world? Meanwhile, the investigation was proceeding at full speed. The abandoned Impala had been found Monday morning by a farmer checking his fields. It had been reported immediately, and crime scene technicians had descended on it, looking for evidence. They found fingerprints, lots of them. Some belonged to the Bade family, which made sense since it was their car. But there were other prints too, ones that didn't match any of the victims. Those prints were run through the system, and they came back with matches: Alan Fryer, David Fryer, James Fryer, combined with Sandra Chesky's identification from the photo lineup. Law enforcement now had definitive proof of who had committed the murders. Arrest warrants were issued for all 3 brothers on 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Every law enforcement officer in South Dakota, Iowa, Minnesota, and Nebraska had photos of the Fryer brothers. Be on the lookout, armed and dangerous, shoot to kill if necessary. The manhunt intensified. Tips started pouring in from the public. The Fryer brothers had been seen at a gas station in Luverne. They'd been spotted at a diner in Worthington. Someone thought they saw them at a rest stop on Interstate 90. Most of the tips turned out to be dead ends, people seeing what they wanted to see, or mistaking other rough-looking men for the wanted fugitives. But each tip was investigated thoroughly. On Monday night, the Fryer brothers made their move on the hospital. They'd spent the day watching McKennan Hospital from a distance, noting the comings and goings, trying to figure out where Sandra Chesky's room was and what kind of security was in place. What they didn't know was that police had anticipated exactly this scenario. Sheriff Vander Wilt had predicted that the brothers might try to eliminate their only witness, and he'd taken precautions. Not only was there a uniformed officer posted outside Sandy's door, but there were also plainclothes detectives stationed throughout the hospital. Security had been briefed with photos of the Fryer brothers, and all hospital staff had been instructed to call security immediately if they saw anyone matching the descriptions. Around 10 p.m., Alan, David, and James Fryer approached the hospital on foot. They'd parked their car 3 blocks away, not wanting to risk being spotted. They were all armed, Alan with his shotgun concealed in a long coat, David with a handgun, James with a knife. The plan was simple: slip in through a side entrance, find the stairs, make their way to wherever the girl was being kept, eliminate her quietly, and slip back out before anyone noticed. It was a terrible plan, born of desperation and panic. They made it as far as the side entrance before things went wrong. A security guard named Robert Hayes was doing his rounds when he saw 3 men approaching the building. Something about them set off alarm bells in his mind. They were moving furtively, looking around nervously, and one of them had a bulge under his coat that looked like it might be a weapon. Hayes had been shown photos of the Fryer brothers earlier that day. He looked at these 3 men more closely, and his blood ran cold. It was them. Hayes didn't approach them. He immediately radioed the hospital security office, and then called the Sioux Falls Police Department. "This is security at McKennan Hospital," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "The Fryer brothers just tried to enter through the east side entrance. I repeat, the Fryer brothers are here." Within minutes, the hospital was swarming with police officers. The Fryer brothers, seeing the sudden influx of law enforcement, realized they'd been made. They turned and ran. "Stop," Police, an officer shouted, drawing his weapon. But the brothers didn't stop. They ran down the street, splitting up in an attempt to evade capture. Alan went north, David went east, and James headed south. Police cars converged from all directions, sirens wailing, lights flashing. James Fryer was the first to be caught. He'd made it only 2 blocks from the hospital before his lungs started burning and his legs began to give out. James had never been athletic, never been fast. While Alan had the hardened endurance of a veteran, and David had street smarts born from years of running from the law, James was just a follower who'd gotten in over his head. He ducked into an alley behind a grocery store, gasping for breath, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might explode. He could hear sirens everywhere, the sounds bouncing off buildings, making it impossible to tell which direction they were coming from. The knife felt heavy in his pocket. He pulled it out, looking at the dim light cast by a street lamp. What had he become? How had he ended up here, running from the police after participating in the murder of 4 innocent teenagers? He thought about his mother, about how disappointed she would be. She'd always said Alan was a bad influence, that David would end up in prison for good someday, but she'd held out hope for James. "You're different from your brothers," she'd told him countless times. "You can be better than them. You can make something of yourself." But he hadn't been better. He'd followed Alan just like he always did, and now 4 kids were dead, and he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. Or worse. James looked at the knife again. For a moment, he considered using it on himself. It would be easier than facing what was coming. Easier than sitting in a courtroom while families of the victims stared at him with hatred in their eyes. Easier than spending decades in a cell, knowing what he'd done. But he couldn't do it. He was too much of a coward even for that. Footsteps echoed in the alley. Heavy boots on pavement. A flashlight beam swept across the walls, searching James Fryer. A voice called out. "When know you're in there. Come out with your hands up." James dropped the knife and stepped out from behind the dumpster where he'd been hiding. The flashlight beam hit him directly in the face, blinding him. He raised his hands above his head, squinting against the light. "Don't shoot," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm unarmed, I'm coming out." 4 police officers surrounded him within seconds, their weapons drawn, their faces grim. One of them kicked the knife away while another yanked James's arms behind his back and snapped handcuffs on his wrists. "James Fryer, you're under arrest for the murders of Michael Hadrath, Stuart Bade, Roger Essam, and Dana Bade, and the attempted murder of Sandra Chesky," the officer said, reading him his rights. James didn't resist. He couldn't even look at the officers. He just stared at the ground as they led him to a patrol car and pushed him into the back seat. 1 down. 2 to go. David Fryer had better luck initially. He'd headed east, running through residential neighborhoods, cutting through backyards, jumping fences. He was in better shape than James, and he knew how to evade police. He'd done it before, multiple times. He found himself in a quiet neighborhood about 6 blocks from the hospital. The houses were dark, most of the residents already asleep. David crouched behind a parked car, trying to catch his breath and think. The hospital had been a mistake. They should have just run, gotten as far away as possible. But Alan had been fixated on killing the girl, and David had gone along with it because that's what he always did. Alan was the leader. David and James were the followers. But now James had been caught. David had heard the commotion back near the hospital, heard the officers shouting James's name, which meant his youngest brother was either in custody or dead. David pulled out the handgun he'd taken from the motel room. It was loaded, safety off. If the cops found him, he wasn't going down without a fight. He heard a dog barking somewhere nearby, then voices. Flashlights appeared at the end of the block, sweeping back and forth. David ran again, this time heading toward a more commercial area where he might be able to find a vehicle to steal or a place to hide. He made it 3 more blocks before he saw the police roadblock ahead. They'd sealed off the area. Smart, they knew the brothers had split up, and they were systematically searching every street, every building, every possible hiding place. David ducked into a 24-hour laundromat, the only business on the block that was still open. An elderly woman was inside folding clothes from one of the dryers. She looked up when David burst through the door, her eyes widening in fear. "Get out," David said, pointing the gun at her. The woman didn't need to be told twice. She dropped her laundry and hurried out the door, leaving it swinging open behind her. David moved to the back of the laundromat, positioning himself where he could see the front door but had cover from the industrial dryers. He checked the gun again, making sure it was ready to fire. He didn't have to wait long. Within 5 minutes, police cars pulled up outside. Officers took positions behind their vehicles, weapons drawn. "David Fryer," a voice called out through a megaphone. "Why have the building surrounded? Come out with your hands up." They had him trapped. There was no back door, no escape route. Just one way in and one way out, and a dozen cops blocking it. He could surrender, throw down the gun, walk out with his hands up, face trial, and spend the rest of his life in prison. Or he could go out on his own terms. "You've got 5 minutes to come out," the voice on the megaphone called again. "After that, we're coming in." David looked at the gun in his hand. Then he looked at the front door, at the shadows of police officers moving outside, at the flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. He made his decision. "I'm coming out." He shoot slowly. David Fryer walked toward the front door of the laundromat, his hands raised above his head, the gun dangling from one finger by the trigger guard. Officers rushed forward the moment he stepped outside, taking him to the ground hard, yanking his arms behind his back. The gun skittered across the pavement. Someone's knee pressed into David's back as handcuffs were snapped on his wrists. "David Fryer, you're under arrest," an officer said, and then proceeded to read him his rights. David didn't say anything. He just lay there on the cold pavement, tasting blood from where his face had hit the concrete, and thought about how his life had led to this moment. 2 down. Alan Fryer was the most dangerous of the 3 brothers, and he knew it. He was smarter, more experienced, more willing to use violence. He'd killed before in Vietnam and now at Gitche Manitou. What was a few more deaths if it meant staying free? When he'd run from the hospital, he'd headed north into a more industrial area of Sioux Falls. Warehouses, storage facilities, auto body shops, all closed for the night. He'd broken into one of the warehouses, smashing a window and crawling through. Inside, it was dark and cold and smelled like motor oil and rust. Alan moved through the darkness carefully, the shotgun held ready. He found a small office area and barricaded himself inside, pushing a heavy desk in front of the door. Then he waited. He could hear sirens in the distance, see the flash of police lights through the grimy windows. They were searching for him, but they hadn't found him yet. Alan knew that eventually they would. There were too many cops, too much area to cover. They'd search every building, every warehouse, every possible hiding spot. It was only a matter of time, but he'd make them work for it. Hours passed. Alan sat in the darkness, his back against the wall, the shotgun across his lap. He thought about Vietnam, about the friends he'd lost there, about coming home to a country that didn't want him, didn't appreciate what he'd sacrificed. He thought about the VA hospital, about the doctors who tried to help him, who diagnosed him with PTSD and depression and a dozen other conditions. They'd given him pills that made him feel numb, therapy sessions that made him angry. They'd told him he could get back normal life. But they'd been wrong. There was no normal life for someone like him. The war had broken something fundamental inside him, and it couldn't be fixed. He thought about the teenagers at Gitche Manitou. Their faces flashed through his mind. Mike with his guitar, Stu trying to protect his little brother, Roger pleading for mercy, young Dana crying for his mother. And the girl Sandy, who somehow survived. Did he feel remorse? Alan searched inside himself for any trace of guilt or regret and found nothing. Just emptiness. The same emptiness that had defined his existence since returning from Southeast Asia. Maybe death would be better. Maybe it would finally make the emptiness go away. As dawn broke over Sioux Falls, a factory worker arriving for the early shift noticed the broken window at the warehouse where he worked. He called the menace. The building was surrounded. "Alan Fryer!" a voice called through a megaphone. "We know you're in there! The building is surrounded!" "Come out with your hands up." Inside the warehouse, Alan heard the command and smiled grimly. This was it. The end of the line. He could surrender like his brothers had. Face trial, face the families of his victims, spend the rest of his life in a cell or on death row, or he could force them to kill him. Go out in a blaze of violence, make them remember his name. Alan stood up, gripping the shotgun tightly. He kicked the desk away from the door and stepped out of the office into the main warehouse area. I said, come out with your hands up. The megaphone voice called again. Alan walked toward the front of the warehouse, where the broken window was, where he could see the shadows of police officers positioned behind vehicles and barriers. Last warning, Fryer. Put down your weapon and surrender. Alan raised the shotgun to his shoulder, aiming toward where he thought the police were positioned. For a moment, everything was still. Then he pulled the trigger. The shotgun blast shattered what remained of the front window, buckshot spraying outward. Police officers dove for cover and immediately returned fire. Dozens of rounds tore through the warehouse walls, through the windows, through the office where Alan had been hiding moments before. The sound was deafening, like thunder rolling continuously. Alan felt the bullets hit him before he heard them. One caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Another hit his chest. Then his leg. He fell backward, the shotgun clattering from his hands. He lay on the cold concrete floor of the warehouse, staring up at the ceiling, feeling his life bleeding out. The emptiness was fading, being replaced by something else. Pain, yes, but also a strange sense of relief. It was finally over. Police officers stormed the warehouse moments later, their weapons trained on Alan's body. One of them kicked the shotgun away while another checked for a pulse. He's alive, the officer said. Barely. Get an ambulance. Alan tried to speak, to say something, but blood filled his mouth. He coughed, spraying red across his chest. The last thing Alan Fryer saw before losing consciousness was the faces of police officers staring down at him, their expressions grim and satisfied. He'd wanted to go out in a blaze of glory, but all he'd managed was a pathetic last stand in a warehouse, cut down by police bullets. Not exactly the ending he'd envisioned. Alan Fryer was transported to McKinnon Hospital, ironically the same hospital where Sandra Chesky was recovering from the wound he'd inflicted. He was taken directly to surgery, where doctors worked for 3 hours to stabilize him. He'd been hit 4 times and had lost massive amounts of blood, but he would survive. He would survive to stand trial for what he'd done. By noon on Tuesday, November 20th, 1973, all 3 Fryer brothers were in custody. James had already been transported to the county jail. David was being held in a separate facility for his own safety. There were concerns that other inmates might try to hurt him once they learned what he'd done. And Alan was handcuffed to his hospital bed, with 2 armed officers standing guard outside his room. The manhunt was over. Sheriff Doug Vander Wilt held a press conference that afternoon, standing on the steps of the Lyon County Courthouse, facing a sea of reporters and cameras. I'm pleased to announce that all 3 suspects in the Gitche Manitou murders have been apprehended, he said, his voice steady and professional. Alan Fryer, David Fryer, and James Fryer are in custody and will be charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The reporters erupted with questions, shouting over each other. Sheriff, can you tell us about the arrest? Were there any casualties during the apprehension? What can you tell us about the suspects' motives? Vander Wilt held up his hand for silence. The arrests were made without any civilian casualties, though Alan Fryer was wounded when he fired on police officers. As for motive, we're still investigating, but it appears this was a robbery that escalated into murder. The suspects took approximately $23 and some personal items from before executing them. $23. 4 young lives ended for $23 and a cheap bracelet. The number would haunt everyone who heard it. What about Sandra Chesky? Another reporter called out. How is she doing? Miss Chesky is recovering from her injuries and is expected to make a full physical recovery, Vander Wilt said. She showed incredible bravery throughout this ordeal, and her testimony will be crucial in bringing these men to justice. After the press conference, Vander Wilt returned to the hospital to check on Sandy. He found her sitting up in bed, her parents on either side of her. She looked better than she had the day before. There was color in her face, and the pain medication seemed to be working. I heard they caught them, Sandy said when the sheriff entered. All three of them. That's right, Vanderwilt confirmed. They can't hurt anyone else now. Sandy nodded, and some of the tension seemed to leave her body. She'd been terrified that the men would come for her, would finish what they'd started. Now that they were in custody, she could finally breathe a little easier. What happens now? She asked. Now comes the legal process, Vanderwilt explained. There will be a trial. You'll have to testify about what happened that night. I won't lie to you, Sandra, it's going to be difficult. But you're the strongest person I've ever met, and I know you can do it. Sandy looked at her parents, then back at the sheriff. I want to testify, she said firmly. I want to make sure they pay for what they did. For Mike and Stu and Roger and Dana, they deserve justice. Over the next few days, as Alan Fryer recovered from his wounds, the three brothers were formally arraigned. They were each charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The prosecution was seeking the death penalty for all three. The arraignment was held in a packed courtroom, with every seat filled and dozens more people standing in the hallway outside. Family members of the victims were there, many of them weeping. Community members who wanted to see the monsters who destroyed so many lives were there. Media from across the country were there, their cameras capturing every moment. The Fryer brothers were brought in one at a time, wearing orange jumpsuits and shackles. They looked smaller somehow, less threatening than they had on that night at Gitche Manitou. James kept his head down, refusing to look at anyone. David stared straight ahead, his expression blank. Alan looked around the courtroom with cold, empty eyes, showing no emotion whatsoever. When asked how they pleaded, all three answered the same way, not guilty. The victims' families erupted in anger and anguish. How could they plead not guilty when there was a survivor who could identify them? When their fingerprints were all over the stolen car? When the evidence against them was overwhelming? But that was their right under the law, and so the legal process would continue. The trial was set for March 1974, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. The prosecution would be led by Loudoun County Attorney Thomas Andrews, a seasoned prosecutor with a reputation for being tough but fair. The defense attorneys, separate counsel for each brother, had their work cut out for them. The evidence was damning, the crime was horrific, and public opinion was completely against their clients. But even monsters deserve a defense. That's how the system works. In the weeks following the arrests, more details about the Fryer brothers emerged. Alan's military records were obtained, showing extensive combat experience and multiple citations for bravery, but also evidence of severe psychological trauma. Medical records from the VA hospital documented his struggles with PTSD, his violent outbursts, his inability to reintegrate into civilian life. David's criminal record was laid bare. Arrest after arrest, conviction after conviction, parole violation after parole violation. He'd been in and out of the system since he was a teenager, each stint in prison making him harder, more violent, more callous. James's record showed a different pattern. His crimes were mostly minor, often committed in the company of his brothers. Psychologists who examined him described him as having a dependent personality, someone who lacked the ability to stand up to dominant figures in his life. He'd followed Alan because he didn't know how to do anything else. None of this excused what they'd done. But it did paint a picture of how three brothers from rural South Dakota had ended up committing one of the most brutal crimes in Midwest history. Sandra Chesky was released from the hospital on November 28, 1973, 11 days after the murders. She could walk, talk, and function normally, though she still had severe headaches and would need follow-up care for months. The physical scars would fade with time. The psychological scars would last forever. Her first night home, Sandy couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back at Gitche Manitou, kneeling in the dirt, feeling the gun pressed against her skull, hearing the shotgun blasts, watching her friends die. She would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, her parents rushing in to comfort her. This became the pattern. Night after night, the nightmares came. Sometimes they were exact replays of what had happened. Sometimes they were worse, The men caught her before she could play dead. Or she ran and they hunted her through the darkness. Or she was forced to watch her friends die over and over and over. Her parents got her into therapy immediately. Dr. Margaret Foster, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma, began working with Sandy 3 times a week. What you experienced was extreme trauma. Dr. Foster explained during one of their early sessions. Your mind is trying to process something that's almost impossible to process. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the fear, these are all normal responses to an abnormal situation. When will it stop? Sandy asked. She was so tired. Tired of being afraid. Tired of reliving the worst night of her life every time she closed her eyes. I wish I could give you a timeline, Dr. Foster said gently. But trauma doesn't heal on a schedule. It takes time and work and patience. But I promise you, it will get better. Not quickly and not easily, but it will get better. Sandy wanted to believe her, but it was hard to imagine ever feeling normal again. She couldn't go back to school. The thought of sitting in a classroom, surrounded by other students, felt impossible. Everyone would be staring at her, whispering about her, talking about what happened. She was that girl. The survivor, the one who'd watched 4 people die and somehow lived to tell about it. The school arranged for a tutor to come to her house so she could keep up with her studies. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was kind and patient, never pushing Sandy too hard, understanding that some days the girl could barely focus on anything except staying alive. The holidays were especially difficult. Thanksgiving came and went, a somber affair where Sandy's family tried to be grateful that she was alive while knowing that 4 other families were mourning their dead children. Christmas was worse. The Haydrath family left Mike's stocking hanging by the fireplace, unable to take it down. The Bade family set places at the dinner table for Stuart and Dana, unable to accept that they were gone. The Essam family canceled all celebrations, their grief too overwhelming for any pretense of holiday cheer. Sandy sent cards to all the families expressing her sorrow, her guilt, her wish that she could have saved them. The responses were mixed. Some families thanked her for remembering their children. Others couldn't respond at all, too lost in their own grief. One mother wrote back saying she didn't blame Sandy for surviving, but she couldn't help but wonder why Sandy had lived when Arsène had died. That letter haunted Sandy more than any of the nightmares. As the new year began, preparations for the trial intensified. Thomas Andrews, the prosecutor, met with Sandy multiple times to prepare her testimony. He was kind but direct, explaining exactly what would happen in the courtroom. You're going to have to tell your story in front of the defendants, Andrews said. You'll have to look at them, identify them, describe what they did. Their defense attorneys will cross-examine you, trying to poke holes in your testimony or make you seem confused or unreliable. I'm not confused, Sandy said firmly. I know exactly what I saw. I know exactly what they did. I believe you, Andrews said. But their lawyers will everything they create reasonable doubt. That's their job. You need to be prepared for that. Sandy nodded. She understood. And she was ready. She would face her nightmares in that courtroom. She would look those men in the eyes and tell the world what they'd done. For Mike, for Stu, for Roger, for Dana, they deserved justice, and she would make sure they got it. The trial of the Fryer brothers was set to begin on March 11, 1974, in the Lyon County Courthouse in Rock Rapids, Iowa. Due to the extensive pretrial publicity, there had been motions to move the trial to a different venue, but the judge denied them. This crime had been committed in Lyon County, and it would be tried in Lyon County. Security at the courthouse was unprecedented. Metal detectors were set up at all entrances. Armed deputies were stationed throughout the building. Death threats had been made against the defendants, and there were concerns that someone might try to exact vigilante justice before the legal system could run its course. The jury selection took 3 days. Finding 12 impartial people who hadn't heard about the case proved nearly impossible. Everyone in the Tri-State area knew about the Gitche Manitoba massacre. Eventually, a jury was seated. 8 men and 4 women, ranging in age from 23 to 67, all of whom swore they could set aside their personal feelings and judge the case based solely on the evidence presented. On the morning of March 11th, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the gallery. Sketch artists sat with their pads, ready to capture the proceedings since cameras weren't allowed. The victims' families sat together on one side of the courtroom, holding hands supporting each other. On the other side, far fewer people, some distant relatives of the Fryer brothers, though their mother notably refused to attend, unable to face what her sons had done. The Fryer brothers were brought in separately, each flanked by deputies. They sat at 3 different defense tables, their lawyers beside them. James looked terrified, his face pale, his hands shaking. David sat with a bored expression, as if he couldn't care less about the proceedings. Alan stared straight ahead, his face a mask of indifference, showing no emotion whatsoever. Judge Harold Morrison took the bench, an elderly man with silver hair and a reputation for running a tight courtroom. He surveyed the packed gallery, then turned to address the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said in a gravelly voice, "you are about to hear evidence in one of the most serious cases ever tried in this county. 4 young people lost their lives on November 10, 1973, and a 5th was gravely injured. 3 men stand accused of these crimes. It will be your job to determine whether the evidence proves beyond a reasonable doubt that these 3 men committed these acts." He paused, looking at each juror in turn. "This will not be easy. You will hear testimony that will disturb you. You will see evidence that will upset you. But you must set aside your emotions and judge this case solely on the facts presented. Can you do that?" The jurors nodded solemnly. "Well," Judge Morrison said. "Mr. Andrews, you may present your opening statement." Thomas Andrews stood and approached the jury box. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with graying temples and sharp eyes. He looked at each juror before beginning to speak. On the evening of November 17, 1973, 5 teenagers went to Gitche Manada State Preserve for what they thought would be a fun, innocent evening around a campfire. He began, his voice clear and steady. They were going to roast marshmallows, listen to music, and enjoy each other's company. They were kids, just kids. The oldest was 18. The youngest was 13. He paused, letting that sink in, but they never came home. 4 of them died that night, executed by 3 men who'd come to the preserve looking for easy targets to rob. When those men found that the teenagers had only $23 between them, they decided the kids had seen their faces and needed to be eliminated. Andrews walked back to the prosecution table and picked up a photo. He held it up so the jury could see. It was a school picture of Mike Hadrath, smiling, full of life. Michael Hadrath was 18 years old. He played guitar and dreamed of being a musician. He was shot in the back of the head while kneeling on the ground, begging for his life. He picked up another photo. Stuart Bade in his basketball uniform. Stuart Bade was 17. He was an athlete, a loyal friend, a devoted son and brother. He was shot in the back of the head while kneeling beside his best friend's body. Another photo, Roger Essam, serious-faced in his school portrait. Roger Essam was 17. He planned to join the military and serve his country. He was shot in the back of the head while praying for salvation that never came. Dana Bade, young and innocent, smiling in his Little League uniform. Dana Bade was 14 years old, a child. He died calling for his mother, shot in the back of the head by men who felt nothing. Andrews set the photos down and turned back to the jury. And then there was Sandra Chesky, 13 years old. She was shot last, and through a miracle that none of us can fully explain, she survived. She will testify before you. She will tell you what happened that night. She will identify the men who murdered her friends and tried to murder her. He pointed at the 3 defense tables, at the 3 brothers sitting there, Dylan Fryer, David Fryer, James Fryer. The evidence will show that these 3 men committed these murders. Their fingerprints were found in the stolen car. Sandra Chesky identified them from photographs. They were apprehended trying to enter the hospital where Sandra was recovering, intending to finish what they'd started. Andrews walked back to the jury box, placing his hands on the railing. "This is not a complicated case, ladies and gentlemen. The evidence is clear. The guilt is certain. And when you've heard all the testimony and seen all the evidence, I am confident you will return the only verdict that justice demands: guilty on all counts." He returned to his seat, and Judge Morrison turned to the defense. The defense attorneys had decided that James's lawyer would give the opening statement, since James was the youngest and least culpable of the three brothers. Attorney Michael Chen stood and approached the jury. He was younger than Andrews, in his mid-30s, and he looked uncomfortable with the task ahead of him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chen began, "my client, James Fryer, does not deny that he was present at Gitche Manitou State Preserve on the night in question. He does not deny that terrible crimes were committed there. But presence does not equal participation. Being there does not make him a murderer." Chen gestured toward James, who kept his head down, refusing to look at the jury. James Fryer is 22 years old. His entire life, he's been dominated by his older brother Alan, a man who returned from Vietnam deeply damaged, prone to violence, incapable of empathy. James was terrified of Alan. He did what Alan told him to do because he was afraid of what would happen if he didn't. Andrew started to object, but Judge Morrison waved him down. This was opening statements. The defense had a right to present their theory of the case. Chen continued, "The evidence will show that James Fryer did not fire a weapon that night. He did not rob the victims. He did not plan the murders. He was a frightened young man who found himself in a situation that spiraled out of control, and he was too afraid to stop it. It wasn't much of a defense, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. But it was all Chen had." The other defense attorneys made similar arguments for David and Alan, claiming either diminished capacity due to mental illness, or that the evidence was circumstantial. But nobody believed them. The trial was about to begin, and everyone knew how it would end. The guilty verdict was a foregone conclusion. The only question was, would it be death or life in prison? On the third day of the trial, Sandra Chesky took the stand. The courtroom fell completely silent as she walked to the witness box. She was 14 now. Her birthday had passed in December, but she looked younger, small and fragile in her best dress, her hair pulled back to reveal the scars on her scalp where the surgeons had operated. Every eye in the courtroom was on her. The judge, the reporters, the victims' families, and most importantly, the three Fryer brothers, who were seeing their only surviving victim for the first time since that night. Sandy was sworn in, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it on the Bible. "I do," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas Andrews approached gently. "Sandra, I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell the jury what happened on November 17, 1973. Sandy took a deep breath and began. She described the bonfire, her friends laughing and playing music. She described the three men emerging from the darkness with guns. Her voice remained steady as she recounted the robbery, the march into the clearing, the executions. "I watched them kill my friends," she said, tears streaming down her face, "one by one. Mike first, then Stu, then Roger, then Dana, and then it was my turn." "Can you identify the men who did this?" Andrews asked. Sandy's hand rose, pointing directly at the defense tables. "That's them. Alan Fryer shot me. David Fryer was there with a rifle. James Fryer had a handgun. All three of them murdered my friends." The courtroom erupted. Several family members broke down sobbing. Judge Morrison had to call for order during cross-examination. The defense attorneys tried to suggest Sandy was confused, traumatized, that her memory couldn't be trusted. But Sandy held firm. She'd seen their faces in the firelight. She'd heard their voices. She would never forget them. When she finally stepped down from the witness box after 2 hours of testimony, the prosecution's case was essentially won. The physical evidence supported her story completely. The fingerprints, the stolen car, the murder weapons recovered from Alan's possession when he was arrested. The defense presented their case over the next week, calling psychiatrists to testify about Alan's PTSD, about James's dependent personality disorder, about David's antisocial tendencies. They argued for mercy, for understanding, for recognition that these were damaged men who needed help, not execution. But the jury saw something different. They saw three cold-blooded killers who'd murdered children for pocket change. The deliberation took 6 hours. When the jury returned, their faces were grim. Judge Morrison asked for the verdict. "On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Michael Hadrath, how do you find the defendants?" "Guilty." The three defendants. The same verdict came for Stuart Bade, for Roger Essam, for Dana Bade. And for the attempted murder of Sandra Chesky, guilty, guilty. The sentencing phase would determine whether they received death or life imprisonment. More testimony followed, more psychiatrists, more family members pleading for the lives of their sons and brothers, more victims' families demanding ultimate justice. In the end, the jury recommended death for Alan and David, who had been the primary actors in the murders. For James, who'd been pulled a trigger, they recommended life without parole. Judge Morrison accepted the recommendations. Alan and David Fryer were sentenced to death. James Fryer was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. The Fryer brothers were led away in chains, and for the first time since his arrest, Alan Fryer's mask slipped. He looked back at the courtroom, his eyes finding Sandra Chesky sitting with her parents, and he smiled, not a warm smile, not a remorseful smile, but a cold, empty smile that said even now, even facing death, he felt nothing. Sandy stared back at him, refusing to look away. She'd survived him once. She would survive him again. Outside the courthouse, as families gathered and reporters shouted questions, Sandy stood with her parents, exhausted but relieved. Justice had been served. But 4 of her friends were still dead, and no verdict could bring them back. The Fryer brothers appealed their convictions repeatedly over the following years. Alan and David remained on death row while James served his sentence in the general prison population. Eventually, both death sentences were commuted to life imprisonment when Iowa abolished the death penalty in 1965, a decision that was retroactively applied. All 3 brothers would die in prison, Alan in 2013, David in 2020 and James in 2021, having served nearly 50 years for their crimes. Sandra Chesky would spend the rest of dealing with the trauma of that November night. She never fully escaped the nightmares, the flashbacks, the survivor's guilt that haunted her. But she lived. She graduated high school, went to college, got married, had children. She refused to let the Fryer brothers take anything else from her. Years later, she would say in an interview, "They killed my friends. They tried to kill me, but they didn't break me. And every day I'm alive is a day they failed." Gitche Manitou State Preserve remains a place of natural beauty, but it's also a place of memorial. A marker stands near where the murders occurred, bearing the names of the 4 victims: Michael Hadrath, Stuart Bade, Roger Essam, Dana Bade. Visitors still come to pay their respects, leaving flowers and notes. The ancient rocks remember. The Great Spirit remembers, and Sandra Chesky remembers. The years that followed the trial were a journey through darkness for everyone touched by the Gitche Manitou massacre. The families of the 4 murdered teenagers struggled to find meaning in their loss. The Hadrath family moved away from Canton, unable to remain in a town where every street corner reminded them of Mike. They sold their house, packed up their son's belongings, his guitar, his records, his dreams, and tried to start over somewhere else. But grief followed them. It always does. The Bade family, having lost 2 sons in one night, fractured under the weight of their tragedy. The parents divorced within 3 years, each unable to look the other without seeing Stuart and Dana. The surviving children scattered, seeking distance from the memories that suffocated them. Family reunions stopped. Holidays became unbearable. The family that had once been close and loving was torn apart by violence, as surely as if the shotgun had been aimed at them too. Roger Essam's parents never recovered. His mother died of a heart attack 5 years after the murders, and those who knew her said she died of a broken heart. His father lived another decade, but he was a shell of the man he'd been, spending his days sitting in Roger's old room, holding his son's baseball glove, wondering what kind of man Roger would have become. And then there was Sandra Chesky. Sandy's physical wounds healed within months. The scars on her scalp were covered by her hair. The shotgun pellets too deep to remove became just another part of her body. Small pieces of that November night she would carry forever. The doctors had been right, she made a full physical recovery. But the psychological wounds ran deeper than any surgeon could reach. The nightmares never truly stopped. Even decades later, Sandy would wake up screaming, feeling the cold metal of the shotgun barrel pressed against her skull, hearing the blasts, seeing her friends fall. Therapy helped. Medication helped. Time helped. But nothing could erase what she'd witnessed. Survivor's guilt was her constant companion. Why had she lived when they had died? What made her special? What made her worthy of survival when Mike, Stu, Roger, and Dana weren't? These questions tormented her through her teenage years, through college, through her 20s and 30s and beyond. She attended the funerals of all 4 victims. At Mike's service, she placed his broken guitar pick, recovered from the crime scene in his casket. At Stu's funeral, she apologized to his parents for not being able to save him. At Roger's memorial, she promised to live the life he'd been denied. At Dana's burial, she wept for the child who died calling for his mother. Some of the families welcomed her presence. Others found it too painful. She was a living reminder of what they'd lost. One mother told Sandy she didn't blame her for surviving, but asked her not to come to the funeral. "I can't look at you without thinking that my son should be standing there too." Sandy understood. How could she not? She finished high school through home tutoring, unable to return to regular classes where she'd be the survivor, the girl everyone whispered about. She went to college out of state, seeking anonymity, but the story followed her. Professors recognized her name. Students Googled her and found the news articles. She was never just Sandy Chesky, college student. She was always Sandra Chesky, survivor of the Gitche Manitou massacre. She changed her name legally in her mid-20s, trying to escape the shadow of that November night. She moved multiple times, always seeking a place where nobody knew her story. She married a good man who understood her nightmares and her need for lights on while sleeping. She had children and tried desperately to give them the normal childhood she'd lost. But Gitche Manitou was always there, lurking in the background. On the anniversary of the murders every year, reporters would track her down, asking for interviews, wanting to know how she felt, what she remembered, whether she'd forgiven the Fryer brothers. She rarely agreed to talk. What more could she say that she hadn't already said in that courtroom 40 years ago? When Alan Fryer died in prison in 2013, the prison chaplain asked if Sandy wanted to be notified. She said yes. When the call came, she felt nothing, no relief, no satisfaction, just emptiness. His death didn't bring her friends back her nightmares. It changed nothing. David died in 2020, and James in 2021. Each time Sandy was notified, each time she felt the same hollow nothing. The monsters were finally gone. Now, decades after that terrible night, Sandra Chesky, living under a different name in a different state, is a grandmother. She volunteers at a crisis center, helping other trauma survivors. She's turned her pain into purpose, using her experience to help others navigate their own darkness. She still has the nightmares. She still carries the scars. She still thinks about Mike and Stu and Roger and Dana, wondering what lives they would have lived, what dreams they would have achieved, what families they would have raised. But she's also found moments of peace. Moments where she can watch a sunset without seeing blood on ancient rocks. Moments where she can hear laughter without remembering silence. Moments where she can simply be alive without feeling guilty about it. The story of the Gitche Manitou massacre remains one of the most horrific crimes in Midwest history. It's a reminder that evil exists, that innocence can be destroyed in moments, that sometimes terrible things happen to people who don't deserve them. But it's also a story of survival, of resilience, of a 13-year-old girl who refused to die, who played dead in the dirt while her friends' blood pooled around her, who crawled out of that darkness and rebuilt a life. Sandra Chesky survived, and in surviving, she honored the memory of those who didn't. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this case, please leave a comment and subscribe. Good night and stay safe.